Welcome, everyone. We are so grateful that you are here. We'll let folks come into the room and then we'll start.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Welcome for joining us. I think we have everyone coming into the room. Can everyone hear me? Just give me a thumbs up. Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Aziza Hassan, and I have the privilege of serving as NewGround's executive director. NewGround focuses on transforming community through the power of relationship. We believe that conflict is a natural part of being in human relationship, and that by being committed to working through the disagreement, creating compassionate containers where we can hear each other, we can find ways to confront each other and figure out a way through together. And that's how we transform community. And tonight, we have an incredibly special program called Facing Racism in our Muslim and Jewish communities. It's a public dialogue about the function of anti-Black racism in faith communities and how storytelling can be utilized as a tool to build more inclusive faith communities. While NewGround has multi-month programs for professionals, for high school students, and other different programs that really focus on things, being able to talk about difficult conversations, including gender, including Israel and Palestine. Tonight is exclusively focused about anti-Black racism in our faith communities. To illustrate why, a year and a half ago, I was talking to one of the change makers who'd come through our cohorts, a professional that I deeply admire and respect. And I remember talking to him about this moment that we were living in, this reckoning. And as we were talking, and there was this really important exchange between us, kind of looked at me and said, "You know what, Aziza, what took you so long?" And his words still haunt me. I believe that I have been there for that person so many times, and I know he's been there for me. And as a community, we've been there for each other. And yet the reason why it haunts me is because he didn't feel seen. He didn't feel fully seen. And what it means for us to be in community is to be able to lift up each other's authentic experiences and create space for each other, that we can start to slightly take a glimpse of what it is that we're actually dealing with, to truly honor and respect the whole human being in front of us. And tonight, to me, that's exactly what it's all about. Truly honoring another narrative, another experience, and starting to just get a glimpse so that we can start to figure out how we can navigate this moment in more effective ways as allies together. In a moment, I will introduce two remarkable speakers, leaders who are really making a huge difference in our world. We'll go into a conversation with them. They'll tell us some of their stories about how how their personal narratives have lived out and how they've been impacted by living in community right here, right now, as Muslim, as a Jew, in our own spaces, and then have them ask questions of each other, because sometimes when we allow people to just ask questions of each other, we learn even more. And then eventually we'll open it up to questions from the audience. After that, we'll take a short break and then do some important breakout group work after a short prayer break, where you'll get to be able to reflect on some of those narratives in a facilitated conversation. Tonight is brought to you by the Cal Humanities. Really, this is part of a series, and this project was really made possible through their support. They've really made it. You can look at their website at calhumanities.org to learn more and help both Cal Humanities and NewGround by filling out a survey at the end of this evening. Our outcomes are really about listening deeply, about hearing each other and figuring out how we're going to navigate this moment. And to help us do that, we are grateful for Margari Hill and Chava Shervington, who are here with us. They're both kind, smart leaders who model respectful engagement in Muslim and Jewish communities and have both committed to building a more inclusive and racially equitable society. Margari is the executive director of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, and Chava is a board member of the Jewish Multiracial Network. Please take a moment to look at the chat. We have the bios in there, and we know that you've received emails of that before. They have incredible bios, and you should absolutely take a look at them. But for now, we'd like to dive into conversation, starting first with Margari.
Thank you for having me this evening. And yeah, I guess I'll talk about kind of like what storytelling means to me as someone who has been trained in community organizing. And the reason why I tell my story, right? It's, I first started out storytelling because I had a wild imagination. I love sci-fi. I like to think of bold new worlds. And but over time, as I had to think about social justice, right, and I had experienced both anti-Blackness in doing my work, but also, whether we were trying to address that and raise awareness within our faith community around issues, whether that was around Darfur, which there was an ethnic cleansing, like we saw like this kind of genocidal policies, and or dealing with our community showing solidarity. And so telling personal stories where I saw at times my own community dismiss certain people's stories of seeing them as having an ulterior motive or being divisive. And so those stories were silenced. And I also felt that my own stories were silenced for decades. And it was really when we started to amplify stories through doing social media campaigns where my individual story could not be denied if that was something that was reflective of so many others' experience. So we know from organizing, when we share each other's stories and we start to talk about each other's pain, right, that's where we can expand our interest, right? We can expand our self-interest and we can get at the root cause. We're not just telling our stories just to so that we can connect and get to know each other and things go back to the same thing, but we're telling our stories because we want to improve our world. We want to expand our world and make our world more inclusive and more just. So I'll go into two stories that can bring, which I hope can humanize the kind of the struggle without going into the kind of trauma porn, right? Like there's certain things that I've experienced, anti-Black racism, that would kind of normalize the dehumanization that I experienced. And I'm a little bit cautious about doing that. So I'll talk about some of the subtle forms, right? That the microaggressions, the things that may are subtly dismiss certain concerns, but can also expose some of the biases. And so I'll start with my first story when I didn't even have the language around microaggression in 2010 when I was teaching at an Islamic school. I had just left graduate school, and I had been abroad for a year and had experienced what it was like to being Black and Muslim in the Middle East. And that was like in Cairo, Egypt, where there is a large indigenous Black population. Nubians are indigenous to Egypt. And so, often people just kind of either thought I was Sudanese or from the south of Egypt. So I was almost fluent in Arabic. And I plopped myself into a school in North Philadelphia. And in those counters, as a teacher, where half my students were African American and the other half were predominantly Palestinian, and we had a sprinkling of South Asian students. And those were outside of my experience where I was first called, we were in a car and we were first called slaves in Kuwait. So that was the first time I understood a derogatory slur towards Black people, was first in Kuwait. And then the second time where I started to understand things was I was armed with understanding of the Arabic language, was teaching at this school. And when you have your own students who have been taught to have a sense of superiority over Black people, and how did that show up It showed up when they would speak Arabic in front of us Black teachers. And sometimes it would be like diminutive, like terms that they called us, right? You know, where they'd say, oh, don't worry, those Abda, they're our teachers. Being told that, right? Like, or just like they're talking and they're not expecting me to understand. And I'd have to stop my students and say, hey, I understand that, and that's not okay. And the administration, right, like they who had grown up, so two of the administrators were like, yeah, well, we use that term, it doesn't mean anything bad. And I would argue with them, it's like, no, I know for a fact that that term is not acceptable, that there are Black Arabs that do not like the term. It's not just me making that up, and that Black and equating Blackness with slave was not okay. So it's like, how does that term become acceptable, right? Is really speaks to the kind of anti-Blackness that in some ways predated, right, colonialism, but it gets exacerbated, right, because it also brings up that trauma that my ancestors had been enslaved, and therefore I'm still stuck with the stigma, right, of being coming from enslaved people. So that was one, going to the corner store at the school and seeing the kind of favoritism that was happening around who was getting in line first and who was being dismissed. And the second story at the school was one of the teachers. So I have like, we were allowed to have so many sessions where we could, as teachers, we prep. So it was a prep session. And in the prep session, my students were in my class and they were being taught Arabic by from a teacher who was from Iraq. And she was probably, I mean, I hope I'm not misrepresenting, but she was an Iraqi refugee coming, like her family were displaced because of the war. And so in this class, we're mostly Africa, it was 4 African American students. And she was like super kind-hearted, very lovely. And so she started telling her students that when she first came to America, she was very afraid of Black people. Now, this is, mind you, these are teens, right? Who are figuring out their place in the world. And this teacher who has power, who has authority, is sharing how she was afraid of their people. But then she said, as I got to know Black people, they were the hardest working, they're really nice, and all of these things. And so that conversation haunted me. It haunted me for several reasons. It's one, it's like, what a burden to put on students. Second, when I did ask her, so I engaged, like my thing kind of popped up and I was like, so you're afraid of Black people, but not white people who invaded your country? Like it was, who, and she said, oh, it was the movies. Well, there's also very violent movies, right, that show white people eating other people. Like, I mean, we have horror movies all the time, but the real stigma around media depictions and how that imprints on people, even before, like people who never come to America, of seeing Black people as dangerous, as a threat. So those stories that really, the stories that I had at that Islamic school inspired me to eventually go on to form this anti-racism education organization. But it was with the movement for Black Lives where I saw the silence of the Muslim community in 2014. And I had to I wrote a first call to action, right? And it was an article about Eric Garner because it really struck me deeply. And memories came up around my uncle being killed by police and my brother's consistent harassment by the Santa Clara Police Department, Santa Clara County Police Department. And so that shift for us as an organization where we called to action and we had organizations and it was an uphill battle in some ways where we had to make a compelling argument of one, why Muslims should be allowed to protest, right? We had to say, the model minority stuff that was happening, we had to address that. And then we asked for the Muslim civil rights groups to sign our statement. And it was challenging. We had only 300 at the time. Now, my final story will be, it's on the listserv. And after Philando Castile, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were murdered, and it was like on TV, like we could see the videotaping of it. It was just really horrific crime. And many of us Black Muslims, we were shaken to our core in 2016. And, you know, we wanted our community to take a stand, but yet in those listservs, they didn't. They're like, that's not a Muslim issue. But we were impacted. Many of us had faced the other end of policing, and we tried to get our community to stand. And I remember one time there was in that listserv a Muslim woman who leads a very interfaith organization, works with, you know, does education around Muslim issues. She told me that she didn't want to sign a statement because that would jeopardize her relationship with law enforcement. And I was very hurt. And I openly just said, I was like, look, you know, as a Muslim, you know, your relationship, you could leverage your relationship, but I'm asking my co-religionists to take a stand for justice. And instead, I just got a pushback that just became even more verbal, like the violence that I experienced. And then people were like, well, you need to understand her side of the story. But in the meantime, I was getting behind the scenes apologies, but nothing intervening. And at that time, I felt so small and withered, and I felt unsupported. And here I was, like, on the forefront of doing justice work, but yet I did not have someone who had my back and stood for me. And so now we're, you know, it was 4 years later, right, that we had the uprising and this call to address policing. And it's like, that's where people are saying, like, what took you so long? Because in those moments where people were silent, and then now they're like, we had enough, right? And so it does take, you know, for me, it does take every day a grounding and a centering to come to terms with how hard it's been to raise that awareness. And it would take a 9-minute video of a murder for our community to understand that this is a Muslim issue, and that collectively we have to stand for justice, even if it's against our own kin.
Wow, powerful words to end on from the Quran. I'm really struck by, well, everything that you just said. Specifically, what's sticking with me is that you're at the forefront of justice, and yet you felt small, withered, and unsupported. And what it is to hold that and to still try to ground yourself every day as you kind of move forward and you try to find space. Thank you for sharing in such a vulnerable and an important way. And with that, I move to Chava. I know there's a moment to take in from Margari's narrative, and I hope we can all just take a breath, inhale, and then begin with Chava.
So thank you, Margari. That's incredibly powerful. When I got kind of asked to do this, I immediately thought of my very complicated relationship to storytelling. I have always resisted actually storytelling because it is something that for people who are Black in the Jewish community becomes a constant request for us to explain our existence, right? We are this uncontemplated reality, right? That when people encounter us, it is as if they ran into a mythical creature and are like, tell me your story because I don't understand how you exist. And I need you to create a reference point in something that I relate to or understand in order for me to even see and recognize you. And so whenever you're in a Jewish space, whether it was Hillel or, you know, this Jewish group or that, you know, Jewish professional meeting, you know, there's always someone who looks at you and says, so what's your story? And I think a large part of the Black experience in Judaism kind of revolves around that question in a lot of ways, right? It's, I don't see you. I don't know how you are a member of my community. So explain it to me. Validate yourself to me. Explain to me how in some way you meet my personal criteria for belonging, in a way that we don't make that request of other people. You know, when you're in a kosher grocery store or at a Shabbat dinner, or everybody also feels the power to ask you that question, right? When you really think about it, when you're asking someone their story, there's a level of relationship that sometimes is assumed, or power dynamic, because you're asking someone to explain their history, their backgrounds, their pain, their sorrow, whatever it is, but there's an expectation that that is readily available and almost required in order for their acceptance. And so that has been, I think, a constant, just like tension, right? I know part of my relationship to Jewish space is I just want to go somewhere and not be asked that question, right? Like, if I get through an entire Jewish event and no one has asked me my story, my journey, then we're already at a place where I'm like, this place is welcoming. And, you know, that's a bar. I don't know if it's the highest bar, but that's, I think, just kind of a recognition of often where we as a community are holding with regard to acceptance and even acknowledgement of Black Jews in our midst. And I think it's interesting because it plays also with our community's complicated relationship to whiteness. Whereas parts of our community, you know, the Jewish community is very diverse. I'm not gonna, like, obviously, right? There's Jews from all different lands and speak all different languages, but a large part of the American Jewish community is descended from Eastern Europe or Western Europe, but Europe. And that relationship to whiteness was very different. And it is still very different. There's a complicated, you know, hierarchy of whiteness, and Jews always are moving up and down that ladder. And so where does a community that is also constantly re-engaging with where they fit in that hierarchy, how do they react and interact with people who are not on that hierarchy of whiteness at all? And how do they define themselves in relationship to those people, right? I always say that no Jew is ever white until I walk into the room, right? And then the very reason for the question of my story is because I am not white. Because otherwise I fit, particularly as an Orthodox person, I'm very visibly Jewish. I cover my hair, I dress modestly, you know, I have language idioms, etc. Right? So what is the cause of the question? What's the source of the question? And so that there's that conflict. And I think that we as a Jewish community there's a tension, right, between our values, right? We have a lot of expressive values of equality and equity and everyone created in God's image, and there's all of these things building, a better world, a greater world through our own action, some of our core values. But what does that mean when we have to reevaluate our own self-identity in order to live out those values, right? I think that there has been a tension in the fact that we are willing to work on these issues and engage on these issues and talk about race and racism when we are talking about that in the context of everyone else and everywhere else. But what does it mean for us as a community to wrestle with the fact that we've had several Black Jews come to this synagogue and none of them have stayed? That several parents have had to pull their kids out of this Jewish day school because of racist bullying. Or we are always talking about our work or our civil rights work in the context of what we've done for other people and how that requires a level of appreciation. I think that sometimes our own work in this area has created a lack of sensitivity to how that actually affects or impacts people of color in our community. I remember when the movie Selma came out, and there was this Ava DuVernay, like, you're talking about Black female director, created an incredible movie, credible Black icon, this, that. And the largest conversation I heard from my community was, but where are the Jews? And what does it mean when our relationship to the civil rights movement, a movement that was largely led and fought by Black people, even though, like, of the white people involved, Jews were heavily involved, is that we're looking for ourselves and for appreciation and for gratitude for helping other people, right? Like, we're doing the good work for other people. What does it mean when, we wrestle with our own relationships to violence and white supremacy? And so because we have different relationships to law enforcement than the Black people in our communities, our first reaction when there is a rise in anti-Semitism is to ramp up police protection. So I live in one of the neighborhoods here in Los Angeles that was experiencing a recent uptick in anti-Semitic acts. And it created a call for greater police presence. I need to see the police. And so all of a sudden I turn around on my block, there's police on horses, there's police cars every block, there's uniform. I've never seen that many police in all of Los Angeles on any one day, and they were all in my neighborhood at one time. And while a lot of people in the community WhatsApp groups, like, I'm so thankful, this is exactly what we needed, my reaction was to tell my husband, are you sure you want to go to shul tonight? There's a lot of police outside. Because still being a Black person in our neighborhood, we are not expected. And the perception and reaction to a Black person who is theoretically where he doesn't belong in a time of heightened fear, in a time of police anxiety, what does that mean for how we as a community reevaluate and evaluate our relationships to power, to security. I think there's a lot of questions that also all tie up into who do we see ourselves as the community? Who do we envision when we say the Jewish community?
Yes, who? You've asked a number of questions that I think are important for us to continue wrestling with during this next portion. But to begin, like when we're talking about narrative and people feeling power to be able to ask you about your story, there's something powerful about story and there's something remarkably exhausting about story, like literally having to explain yourself all the time and the tax that it gives and it has on an individual. And yeah, and what it means for us to be able to continue wrestling, even and especially when we have to ask ourselves, are you sure it's a good idea for you to go to shul tonight because you're not expected? Thank you for bringing those insights in. I would like to, if we could pin Margari and Chava, and right now we'd really like to go deeper into everything that you've both brought up. Our objective here is to have an open and an impromptu exchange based on what you've heard from each other and to discuss actionable tools to navigate and combat racism. So mostly we're especially interested in hearing what questions and reflections you have for each other. And I might chime in to make sure that we're also pulling out some specific threads. So to start us off, what questions do you have each other, or what's emerging right now as you're putting your different stories and questions next to each other?
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of my initial questions are really for Chava is to I like trying to find that sense of belonging, right? And like I know what I've struggled with, so I'm interested to know, have you experienced this through, is that too, which is that tension, right? It's like to belong, right? But then when you push back, or maybe you just try to find, can you give me some space to breathe and to be human, right? Like maybe you don't want to tell that story, or maybe certain things may have made you feel small or diminished your humanity, and you just say like, okay, ouch. If you do it, ouch. Have you saying an ouch when somebody has said something, whether it's microaggressive or even just outward, like they're it could be macro aggressive, like it could be, something that's very explicit that's stated. But like, how has that, like when you push back and try to exert your humanity, or just say like, look, I want, I want respect too in these spaces, does that make those spaces unbelonging? Like what is the cost, right, of that? Like, do we have to belong in a space and to have the friends that we have? Like, are we able to maintain healthy friendships when we push them to be better in how they communicate? Or do we lose those friends and those relationships when we call them into account and just say, whether we're saying like, ouch, that hurt my feelings, or say like, hey, what you said was problematic also, or what you did was embarrassing for our faith community, and just don't do that again? Like, what is the cost of pushing back? And is there hope, right, that we can do this work and maintain the relationships? So I'm gonna ask you that, and I'll share like a little bit of like what my experience has been like of doing this kind of work.
So I think there's definitely a cost. And part of my own maturation in this work has been about figuring out where those lines are for me. And how do I allow myself enough space to be able to be in community, even knowing like in that place of conflict and tension, right? And part of it is me curating my relationships and not just me saying like, I'm not going to go to that place because they have a certain type of reputation, but it's also curating my relationships with certain individuals. It is saying, I don't want to know more about your opinion on race. And so we're not going to go there. And it requires you to have, in certain ways, a level of superficiality in your relationships. And what would it mean for people to be able to have really deep trust in each other? And part of, like, there's a way in which, the community is beautiful and chesed. And when I had a baby, I had meals for weeks. But also, when I see their responses to the murder of George Floyd on, their social media or in community groups, then there does remain a question in my head. Like, they cooked me a meal, but, chas v'shalom, God forbid, like something happened to someone in my family, what would their response be? Would they be a person who supported me? Or would they be like, I need to know the whole story. The video only started here, and then pick apart, well, he only came to show up 3 times this week. He didn't come to, what would the justification be in order to keep our own worldview? Like, how tightly are we tied to our own realities that we can't accept new information that contradicts it? Yeah, and for me, it's just been finding ways to hold space, finding, other Jews of color, other Black Jews, forming relationships and community in order to be able to have spaces that I don't have to curate, and places where I don't have to, kind of code switch, for a lack of a better word. But that's the way I've been able to maintain my deep engagement in this work, because otherwise it would have just been, a constant barrage of other people's emotions. I think when you do this work, you end up managing other people's emotions a lot. So rather than kind of informing them about how racism impacts you, you're managing their emotional response to your stories and your trauma and your oppression, and where are spaces where you can create that you have refuge from that. I don't know if we also have kind of the same type of need.
Yeah, I mean, I have some challenges as somebody that's been like a transplant, who's just transplanted in different places. So then when I go to, and I think there's even, I think, well, I have one difference. One is that there is a large Black Muslim community, but at the same time, my experience of being Muslim has been in predominantly led by non-Black South Asian and Middle Eastern spaces. And so so that within itself, it's like, okay, here's that community where I'm almost like in exile. My daughter's back there doing stuff, and I'm like, she does not know I'm like in a very important, I'm in a panel, Zian. I'm in a panel, so I will make you food after. I had made her waffles right before this, but they go through like so. But that sense of belonging, right, is it's sort of, it dodges me as someone who is both like an empath. I'm very sensitive, and then I'm also like, I speak my mind. Like, it's like I can't do the poker face thing. Like, I really, if something does grate me, I may bring that up, like, hey, that wasn't an okay statement. So what I found is that there is either the pushing out or it's the uninvite. It could be the uninvite from spaces where people are organizing, where they're just like, okay, this person is angry. So whether we're cast as an angry Black Muslim woman, and even our organization, we were seen as troublemakers initially when we brought up certain issues, whether it's around law enforcement, around anti-Blackness. And addressing that, I was, I mean, the things that I've been called, like, whether it's like, just like I talk there's another term that they use for it, but I was like, no, I mean, we're doing this out of love, because there's a number of things I could be doing with my life, and doing anti-racism was not a lifetime dream. I'm doing this because it's necessary. Like I said, I always wanted to be that writer, and I don't get to write that because I'm doing this organization, and it is soul work, it is hard work, it's a struggle. And so, but what I do find is that the closeness of that fringe, like it's very hard to form bonds with people that you have to constantly correct because they haven't done the work. And I think that's the important thing. It's like, I guess, like, how do we kind of curate the friendships of folks who have done the work and they could do that work elsewhere, so that we can either build and grow in community, but I'm not the magical Negro that's the cause and impetus of their transformation, because I'm still left without a friend, I'm still left without a community, but I've just left in doing this work. And if you notice, most of the magical Negroes grow somewhere else and disappear out of the lives. So that's what I think is the struggle of doing anti-racism work, and even the critique from my own Black Muslim community that they have of me doing anti-racism work. It's like, they're just like, nah, we're not really feeling that. Like, they're not, so it's just like, and they're like, what are you doing? And so it could be a very lonely place to do, like, as we were trying to reach out. And I guess I'm not saying I know, like, I have a solution to the loneliness. I have hope. There's some people who I know, like, they've done the work, or they just have deep compassion, and they just always give me hope that this work matters. But I guess if I was going to lead to like a second question that sort of ties to that, right? Is it that your community wants to, is there a time where you're kind of pushed forward to be that spokesperson to show that the community exemplifies values that it may be a little ambivalent about?
It was really funny because I was actually going to ask you the same question. I think that we're in a really interesting moment where the Jewish community has often been a leader in engaging on certain social justice issues. What happens when that social justice issue is race, right? And what happens when now it's an uncomfortable position, like the conversation around people's engagement, where they fit into spaces of leadership and visibility has shifted a lot, in the last, 40 or 50 years since the last major racial based, civil rights movement. So how does that impact organizations' desire to lift up and invest in Jews of color and Black Jews, right? And so that's always something that I wrestle with. Like, is this an authentic realization of the fact that we're not optional members, like we're not an option to think about or not think about? Or is it that we're a necessary voice in order to give our community authenticity in these conversations? And it's a conversation that I have, and depending on maybe the organization or the ask, I come down on different, in different places at different times. But I think that there has definitely been a desire to, in certain places and in certain spaces, to publicly lift up, showcase whatever, like, Jews of color, particularly Black Jews. I mean, I have friends who are, more fair, and they're just like, they're not they're looking for someone, they're looking for someone who's going to stand out in the photo. When I offer say, hey, I got a call for a speaking engagement, do you want to participate? They're like, I'm not who they're looking for. Because, and kind of the ways in which, even kind of like colorism, like may impact the call for a speaking engagement, but like the alternative is impacts it alternatively when you're talking about hiring for an organization. I think that visibility has definitely outpaced the underground work. And I think part of my desire for the work in my community is that people recognize that shifting the face of the person doing the talking is not the work, right? Having me talk versus, Rachel Rosenblum, who has, who's white with curly brown hair, that's not the goal. The goal is making a community in which I end up speaking because I've been engaged all throughout the different levels of our community. And I am so engaged and so invested in your organization that you didn't have to call me from somewhere else. I was already within your organization and a visible and valued leader. So I feel like that's now the conversation I'm trying to guide. I don't know if the same thing happens. I feel like, part of the thing that we talked the last time we talked is that I feel like Black Muslims have their own spaces. They have their own communities. In a lot of ways, because Black Jews don't have our own spaces, right? We have no option but to do racial equity work, right? To do anti-racism work. I can't take my balls and go home because there's nowhere to go. And is there a way in which having your own spaces or institutions provides maybe kind of a space for refuge, but also a certain type of liberation in this work, in that it can feel more optional than required?
That's such a good question. And I guess there's like two kind of approaches, because there's a community that I think like I definitely on the outliers of, like I had embraced Islam. I took my Shahada at a Warthi Muhammad masjid, but it was 45 minutes away from the community that I grew up. Like it was in Oakland, I lived in San Jose, so I grew up mostly like in the South Bay. And so in that space, or like for people that grow up in that community where they're like nationwide, like they had, like that was like the largest Islamic school system. And even like some of the narratives as far as like how we understand Islam in America, where non-Black Muslims will just erase that whole history, right? Like they'll just be like, oh, like they'll tell the story. Like I saw a video and it was like Islam in Los Angeles, and there was like no telling of just like the whole, like this long history that went from Nation of Islam to like Sunni Islam, and the community that was like embedded in, and how does that shape, like Malcolm X was in Los Angeles, and so even in that narrative, right, wasn't there. So but I think that having that space had allowed for people that grew up in that community, like many of them were like, no, I never experienced racism in the Muslim community until I left that community and went and interacted outside of my city. So they could have spend most of their life not having that experience. Then maybe it's like when they go to college, or maybe they have like a camp that brings them together, then they'll have these encounters. But then there's people like me, right, that either one is like, we may still struggle to find a home in those communities. Like I think there's some that are like more open to newcomers, and other ones are more family oriented, and if you're outside of that, you can't fit in. But then there's like people that done like the Black iftar, so like for us breaking the fast and saying like, let's get together across diaspora, because we have West African, East Africans, South Africans, Black folks. So like, how do we have an affinity space when maybe some of us didn't come from the Worthy Muhammad community, or, some of, and that's especially like in California, there's like a few communities that are led predominantly by African American. And so there's that, right? Like where people could, and what I found was that for Muslims that grew up in that community, they have a healthy sense of themselves as these human beings, right? Like as Black people, and thoroughly like in their Blackness, thoroughly grounded in their Blackness and their Muslimness and their vernacular. And they may not have an interest in engaging in certain social issues. And so because they're like, well, if we go to this other broader space, we're not going to be respected, right? And so I would see like in Chicago every year, they would have like two Muslim conferences on two separate parts of town. And I remember going, like I went to one, like we went to ISNA, which is like the broad, like the mainstream Muslims, but then they have the mosque cares, which is all the way across town. And and sometimes people would say like, oh well, we've tried to connect with them but they're not interested. And given some of that reception, I'm like, well, I could see why like why they're not interested in coming to spaces, because they're not going to be heard, right? So there's that. But the second part of it is that even outside of that structure, that there's this need, like when we did the Black Muslim COVID Coalition, which was like building power to have our collective voice heard in spaces, because we were get silenced, like individuals, you could just get smacked down and any of the listservs, right? If you're just bringing up stuff, and they would say like sometimes harmful things, whether it's around concerns of Black people having high COVID, contracting COVID, right? Or, defending Thomas Jefferson to, concubinage, slavery. Like there's like all these kind of wild debates that happen behind the scenes. And like, there'll be like that one lone Black person mentioning something and kind of getting pushed out and silenced and gaslit through that. So the power building aspect, whether we have a structure or not, has been helpful. Like when we talk to each other and we say like, hey, this person is trying to get you to speak at this event, but do you know what they did to me? And it's sort of contingent upon our own ties as Black people to like say what's going on, so that we can collectively start to push for change, because there's always going to be somebody that doesn't know what's happening, or maybe we'll take that honorarium and we don't know, like our partnership with them makes that person or institution less accountable to addressing their anti-Blackness. And so I think like we still have, even though we have those things, we still have a way to go towards towards building power, so that we could hold our, the kind of gatekeepers who are deciding national agenda, or get more of the resources and the fundraising, to hold them more accountable, one, to some of the promises that they make, two, to how they treat their constituents in their community, and how they feel pushed, when people are pushed out or fired. We have so many documented cases, but because we love community, we're not just gonna like, there's not a bunch of lawsuits and stuff, but it's just like, I've heard so many stories of people who've experienced workplace discrimination, and or just the comments or a hostile work environment. And that's just like working. That's not just like, okay, you go to the masjid and no one talks to you. Well, meantime, like a white convert, like people are lining up, like they'll ask all those questions, like the same thing for a white convert. And they'll be like, where's your story? Where are you from? But a Black convert, they're just like, they don't want to know, because they don't want to get that much involved, because there's certain assumptions, right, around what I may be asking for in solidarity. There could be that, or they're just like, oh, it's every day you just see Black Muslim or Black Muslim that you didn't know in community. But the idea that a white person who had, even like that narrative, a white person who had everything to lose became Muslim. And I've seen it in, I've experienced it where I've been at and the person that they thought was white, because this person was like very light skinned, so they're racialize them as white, they're so curious about their story, and not through the whole evening, no one asked about my story. And so it's the value of the story. So I know that's like a digression, but I think to get to that point is that the power building, I think, is important, whether we have affinity spaces and caucusing, like, curating our relationships with other Black people in our faith tradition, so that we could share stories, find commonalities, and also work to organize to press for change in our community.
Those are really essential components. And I'm appreciating how each of you are actually, through your questions, are allowing for greater insight into ways people can actually be real allies, but also stop like the ways in which we are treat each other as invisible, whether it's, the way or whether or not we ask a story, and or even how we are literally not even treating each other as resources and not wanting to know enough of like what we have to offer. So now we would like to kind of transition a little bit to ask questions. So if you have questions for Chava or Margari, please continue to send them to us in the chat. For the first question for Chava, we've got, what does Black Jewish space look like or feel like for you? How does it create that refuge? Is there anything missing in it for you?
I think that for me, what it provides is a space where you don't have to explain a part of yourself to someone else, that there is, in some ways, certain experiences or ways in which you'll tell a story, like, I went to a wedding, and I introduced myself, and someone said, "Oh, Chava, did you know that that's a Hebrew name?" And I'm like, "Yep, I knew that." And if you're in a Black Jewish space, people be like, "Girl," like they commiserate because they've had that, they know that, and you get that, like you get that understanding reflected back at you. Whereas sometimes in other spaces, you get that, well, do you know what they meant? Like, they didn't really mean that. You're reading into it too hard. A lot of people have names they don't understand, except yada, yada, yada. And it becomes a defense of your own interpretation of your own experience rather than just understanding. And so I think that understanding is like that base level understanding, the lack of explanation you have to do about yourself, your experiences, your frame of reference. There are places where that you can be authentically yourself without having to, and I will also be honest, from a personality perspective, I am authentically myself all of the time, but and I think that some of my friends are, when they meet in like a circle of like, Ashkenazi yeshivish women, some people will be like, did she really just say that? And I'm like, because that's how I am. But also I recognize that everybody is not comfortable like that. My sister and I have different personalities. It's the way you walk into a space and you don't have to worry about the reaction you're gonna get. Just that initial tension every time you walk in a room, you don't feel. What are they lacking? It depends. Not all spaces are all things, right? There are some places where, even though they're Black Jewish spaces, I don't align politically. There are Black Jewish spaces that maybe I don't align religiously. Maybe that even if they're Jewish spaces, in a lot of Jew of color, Black Jewish spaces, I tend to be on the more observant end, which can create its own complexities. So sometimes those things are lacking, but also more Black Jewish spaces are being created in order to account for those spaces that they're lacking. But I think for me, that's the kind of the key thing, the automatic and immediate understanding of experience, and then also that removal of that just like initial like, oh, how's this place going to be before you walk in.
Yeah, taking out that tension where you can just fully exhale and fully be present and not have to defend anything. Like at NewGround, we find that being able to break people up into affinity groups is actually an essential part of finding voice, but just to be seen and being able to just express in ways that eventually allow you to be able to express other ways. Like, so as Margari, you were talking, like I could see that, like my kids go to a Muslim day school, right? I want them to have a solid core before they have to interact with the world and have to defend anything, where they can be solid in who they are. And there's an important part of building oneself up there. Margaret, another question for you, shifting just a little bit, is what is the value of centering Black radical tradition in our faith? What does it look like, and how do we do it right?
Yeah, so I mean, with the Black radical tradition, I mean, a lot of that movement, right? We have many Black Muslim thinkers. I mean, we have, whether it's Malcolm X and his critique of white supremacy, right, and insistence on dignity and respect, like respect me as a human being. And the Black radical tradition, right, is really getting at the root, at the core of things, and it's so important. I mean, especially that that within our community is a tendency to instrumentalize, like, the Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir talks about the instrumentalizing Blackness was like loving Black culture without Black people. And, but there's also sort of like loving Black culture without Black thought and commitment and accountability towards Black liberation. And what we know, I mean, to this day, like even, all of us have benefited from Black freedom struggles, right? I mean, you have, like, in this country, if you're born in the United States, you can, you are a citizen. And what did that come from? That came from fighting for the rights of formerly enslaved people to say, hey, you have birthright. So we all benefit from birthright, as opposed to having to like have that in question. Our citizenship, right? Like, or just immigration rights. So the civil rights movement. So every gain that Black people have made politically, it's not just, it benefits everyone, and what we found is sometimes, like in certain movements, because the whether it's like the narrow goals or just even just the way that white supremacy operates to create buffer classes, but given that like the fulcrum of white supremacy rests on anti-Blackness. And so when you have that and you address that fulcrum, that at its core, then you have greater freedom, right? And that Black freedom fighters, right? Black folks who are work truly committed towards Black liberation, not just like, okay, we're trying to just do, whether it's like racial capitalism or, where they could still adopt xenophobic laws, right? And so we, and we see that, but the Black radical tradition is really going to critique at its core, whether like how political power, how the state operates and how it's violent, right? There's an imaginary that doesn't accept the systems that allow people to be homeless and hungry while there's billions and trillions of dollars spent on wars. And so at the core, the Black radical tradition allows us to think about freedom from a very local, but also very global. And within that, it also, we have the deep authenticity of that, right? You have the cultural capital of like our thinkers who have experienced, like Black folks have experienced the full brunt what white supremacy is, and work to free ourselves, and therefore, you know, like, and have inspired other movements, whether that's like the Red Power movement, which was inspired by the Black radical tradition, the Chicano movement, right? Like so many movements, Asian American organizing. And so I think that there's so much to gain from the Black radical tradition that moves us out of the silos. But if you have a sort of like middle class kind of like movement of acceptance, it kind of forces us into silos and kind of puts us up on the ladder of like, okay, we can do the like respectability politics and be accepted, you know? So I would like to, you know, as we kind of think about that, and like, what do we have to lose if we don't address the systems at its core? And even if we're thinking about the reform is going to happen, like we're working on reform, but it's just saying like I guess it's the idea of when you see a wrong, right? Like you could either move it with your hands, right? You could speak against it, or you can hate it in your heart. But if you can't hate a system in your hearts because you don't have the analysis to see that it's unjust and the people who have been robbed of their dignity, like that they're not getting what they deserve, and this system is exploiting them and all of us to accept that, then you can't hate that thing in your heart. And I think with the Black radical tradition, it allows us to like critique all of that, right? And imagine something bigger. And it's always like it's a continual struggle to like think of new systems and new ways of being in the world that can actually be more just and more aligned with our faith values than the things that we're accepting now, and the things that our children are going to inherit. They're inheriting all of the mistakes that we've made and things we've been complacent about.
Yes, yes, we have a lot to gain, and we have a lot that there's a huge cost to all of this. And I love what you're talking about in terms of what it means for the future of not only ourselves, but our children and what they have to bear. And in that kind of light, I'm going to shift to you, Chava. I mean, you brought up some really critical pieces about law enforcement, especially. And so do you talk with people or leaders in your community about how police presence directly impacts you? And if so, what's been people's responses? Or do they want to protect you as a community member? Or if they're resistant, like what does that look like? And what are some of the specific responses that you've received specifically after the murder of George Floyd?
So I think that the response to the security question either goes one of two ways. One is, oh, we know you, you'll be fine, right? Which implies that everybody, that because they know us, like individual family, that they can mark on a checklist, that the ones that they know and love will be okay, and they're kind of less concerned with maybe people they don't know. And I think sometimes there's a reality, right, that people are feeling unsafe and they are not either aware of other potential alternatives, right? I think we as a country are still wrestling with what does alternatives to traditional securitization and policing look like, you know, because it's not always the best case in all circumstances. And then how do you, and then there are some conversations where, you know, I've literally had people say, I understand and I agree with you. However, everybody is complaining because we don't have an armed guard at the door. And regardless of how I personally, you know, feel about it, I have to get an armed guard at the door because I am worried about people taking the law into their own hands because they feel unsafe. And so where is, I think, a communal conversation around security? I think that at this point, it's not even, gatekeepers can do certain things, right? They can make sure that their security has trainings or conversations around who to expect and who's in the tent and who's not in the tent, and talk about like actual security rather than kind of like the security theater that a lot of this stuff leads into. But I think we as a community have a relationship with what makes us feel safe. And what makes the vast majority of the community feel safe is what makes other people in the community actually unsafe. And so how do we balance those two realities? I still think we are very, very much at like the beginning of the conversation around that. And, you know, kind of going back to like the conversation around like Black Jewish spaces, like what's the difference? When Black Jewish voices are centered and their needs are centered, then things look different, right? Communities operate differently, because the needs and concerns of the people that, you know, are centered are different. And until we get to that space, I'm not sure the reality on the ground is going to look much different. Look, I mean, I've had people offer like, oh, well, don't worry, if something happens, I'll protect you. And I'm like, you know, thank you. I guess, but you know, unless you're gonna hold my hand and walk me down the street, like that's not particularly helpful. You know, or yeah, I mean, I think that that's kind of where it's gotten, is when you have these conversations, I'll have better conversations with my staff, I'll have better conversations with the people we hire, we'll tell them not to just expect who they think a Jew is. I think that's the best case response I've gotten to date, from a Jewish organization or institution with regard to that concern, or being dismissed out of hand where, you know, things are unsafe, I don't know what you want me to do. And I think that's just a larger conversation around the role of policing. And, you know, I'm not necessarily an abolitionist, but kind of what is the role of policing? What is the role of security? What makes people more safe, less safe? I think it's a larger conversation that we as a community need to be engaged in order to like make the answer to that request different.
Right, owning what it means to really wrestle with these really important questions around safety, being centered, being seen. I know that there's so much more that we could continue to dive into here. Forgive me at this point, I want you to see like the breadth of the people who are here. You have folks from across the nonprofit world who are dedicated to this work. You have funders, you have people who are in government, and folks from the Civil and Human Rights Commission. I'm a commissioner. And because of what you were saying, Margari, about like making sure that we have to be clear about bias isn't okay. And there's all these different pieces of how we can continue these conversations. And what I'm appreciating about this particular conversation is that we're able to really give daylight to some really important issues that can't stop here. They need to continue. And so like for, you know, there's all sorts of really important campaigns happening, like LA for All, that the city's doing to try to just make sure that we're getting out in front of the messaging. And there's something really important about being able to dive deeper now. So with that, I want to say, I am so deeply grateful for you, Chava, and Margari, and your willingness to step into this conversation. And I am so sorry to have to stop the conversation here because I feel like we just got started. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to NewGround's Associate Director, Andrea Hodos. You are on mute, Andrea.
I want to thank Chava and Margari so much for bringing this rich conversation. There's a lot for us to dig into. In a few minutes, we're going to take a 10-minute break because it is time for Maghrib and some people will want to pray. Following the break, we hope that everyone will return for a more intimate discussion in small groups. We also know it might be late for some of you. So that if you know you won't be returning after break, please click on the link that will be put into the chat so you can provide feedback to us and to Cal Humanities. And then we'll ask you to log out, which will help us set out our breakout rooms. We'll be able to do that more easily. And whether you're staying or leaving right now, we're really grateful you're here to begin this conversation with us. The breakout groups will be led by our Courage Accelerator cohort members. They've spent the last 6 months learning about bias and racism as it arises in our communities. And in fact, Margari and Chava were with us in that small space first, and we had some wonderful time with them. And that was part of what sparked this program. Some other folks are alums of our 9-month professional fellowship and also from our Magic High School Council. They've learned communication tools and have been building their muscles for having conversations across differences, and they're really excited to hear from you all. So just before, in a moment before break, you're going to be invited to a breakout room. We wanted to get you settled into your room so everyone can come back and be ready to go right at 8:30. The goals of the discussion are to help us reflect on what we've heard and think about what we've learned and felt about our own Muslim and Jewish communities, or for those of you from other faiths, how this conversation is helping you to reflect on your community. We want to hear multiple voices responding to the stories we've heard from Chava and Margari so that we can learn from one another. This is an opportunity for us all to engage together vulnerably so we can take introspective account of how anti-Black racism shows up in our own specific communities. We'll open the rooms in just a moment so that you can settle in. Group leaders will begin the discussion circles promptly at 8:30. There will be an affinity room for Black Muslims, Jews, and Christians who would prefer to be in a space together to talk. Please direct message for Azana if you'd like to join that group. Otherwise, please sit tight, and when the dialogue box pops up and invites you into joining a room, please press the button. I'm wishing you a good little break and really wonderful conversations. Thank you so much for being here.